Uh, all right, I'm back, and since you're watching, so are you. All right, you can see I'm wearing the same stuff, so this has just been a few minutes for me to wet my whistle and scratch my head and look at my graphs and get my thoughts together talking about the minimum wage. And for this graph, put it up there a whole bunch more times. This graph right here, this is the only subject of this particular second video for chapter 4. Okay, so let's just talk about this for a second before we get into the particulars of the graph. So the first thing to understand is that when we're talking about the minimum wage, we first stipulate that all the things we're saying are true for competitive markets where the wage is set at a higher level than would be the case for the market. Okay, so one of the first things to recognize because of that statement is that any given number for the minimum wage, like the federal minimum wage of 7.25, or the various different minimum wages that apply for different cities and different states, can be irrelevant. In other words, if the minimum set, the price floor, if the minimum set is below where the market equilibrium is, which is probably true for 7.25 an hour in most of the United States. In most of the United States, if you specified, hey, I've got a job, I'll hire a qualified person if he or she is want to work for 7.25 an hour, probably the only thing you would get from your job ad is laughter. People would look at it and say, well, I can easily find a job for $8 or $9 an hour. Why would I take your job for $7.25 an hour? You must be crazy. Okay, so when we say things about what the minimum wage does, we're talking about if the market's competitive and we cause the wage to be a price floor, a relevant price floor, a minimum that's higher than the wage would be if we just let it be a free market. Okay? So one of the trick questions on a test is to draw a graph and have the lines intersect at, say, $9 an hour and say, what would be the effect of a $8 minimum wage? And then if you haven't done your work well enough and you haven't gotten to duh, what you do is you run over to the graph and you say, okay, $8 and that's below $9. I mean, there's $8 and oh, the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are different and okay, there's that much unemployment and oh, okay, because it's not at the equilibrium, there's this dead weight loss and no, you just wasted a bunch of time and got the answer wrong. Because if the market equilibrium wage is $9, and a minimum wage is set at $8, or higher than the federal minimum, what's the effect? No effect. What happens? Nothing. Okay? So, don't be fooled. Okay? There's only a surplus of labor, a shortage of jobs. But it's the surplus of labor. It's what matters. Sorry, I'm pointing again. Oops. Okay? I'm pointing again. But it's below the screen. You can see my shoulders moving and I'm not on the screen. Sorry about that. All right. So for the wage to do all of the things that the textbook and I say it's going to do, it's in a competitive market. Okay? Lots of buyers and lots of sellers, easy entry, easy exit, all those conditions we'll get into more later in the semester. It's a competitive market where the government has set the wage higher than it would otherwise be. Okay, so now we can move ourselves over to the graph and we start by refreshing our memory or reminding ourselves that L and Q are kind of the same thing. It's the quantity of labor per some time period, like a week or a month. And W, even though it doesn't say that there, let's see the numbers, right? The 10, the 7, the 6, and the 2 are in dollars per hour, right? It doesn't make any sense to use numbers like that for dollars per week or per month. I guess unless it's in thousands, which, wow, if it's in thousands, that's pretty good for even a whole month, right? Really good. But no, it's dollars per hour. So see, as a diligent student, that's the first thing you do. You orient yourself to what's going on the graph. What does W stand for? What does L stand for, right? What's going on with S? Oh, S, that's the households looking at that willing to supply labor. And there's this 2 down here. And it says that there isn't anybody out there, according to the way the supply line is drawn, there isn't anybody out there that would offer to do low-skill labor for any less than $2 an hour, if the wage is $1.50 an hour, you can't hire anybody. Okay? And again, by that I mean the market wage. If that's the going rate for some bizarre reason, $1.50 an hour, you get no laborers. Okay? And then from 2 on up, more and more people are offering to sell, willing to sell their labor. And right now, all those people that are on that lower part of the supply line, even in the free market, are getting a heck of a deal. Right? By a heck of a deal, in other words, in the free market, the equilibrium wage be $7 an hour, and up to the quantity 125, the opportunity cost of the labor, right? The marginal cost to society, okay, which is almost always equal to the marginal private cost, is less than $7, right? So there's a gain from trade from those individuals selling their labor at $7 an hour. Okay? So, and I by the way, I still have that habit of saying okay a bunch. In class, that works great, because there you are ready to immediately react to it and say, Doc, no, it's not okay. You're speaking Greek to me. And I don't speak Greek. It's, English maybe and Spanish, but not Greek. Translate that back into English, please. So here you can't do that. But what you can do is say, well, Doc just said okay, and it wasn't okay to me. I didn't get it, and I can't ask him questions now, but what I can do before he moves on is I can freeze it. Yeah, see, like that. And write down my question and either post it online or save it for the next class, or both. I prefer that you put it online, not instead of bringing it to class, but at least do that. Why? Because there's so many of your classmates that are too shy, or let's hope that's all it is, or they're somewhere else in terms of their brains, and they don't. Maybe because I'm really eloquent, clown around a little bit, and they think I'm cool. Okay, and so they don't write down the clarification needs that they have when they're just the video just keeps rolling. Okay, and then later on, through their due diligence, okay, some of you are going to go back to chapter 3 after the test and wonder, oh, darn, if only I had looked at these posts in the homework forum and in the regular forum and read through some of those and thought about them and maybe added my own into the various threads or started my own threads. There were all these questions on that first exam. I would have got them right. Maybe I better learn from that this time. And maybe even if I don't post anything, I should at least read the stuff up there, and I'll benefit from the Q&A of others. Okay, so anyway, freeze the frame when I say, okay, if it's not. Okay, scribble down your questions. It's kind of awkward. Well, maybe on your screen you can freeze it and click on the BB Learn button and go put that right there in the online forum and say, Doc, at 8 minutes, okay, which I think is about right on this second edition of the Chapter 4 video, you were talking about such and such, okay, the minimum wage, and you said that $2 means something, something. And, sorry, does not compute. Give me a little bit more to work with, does not compute, or help Mr. Wizard and say, here's what I thought the $2 meant. And by golly, it doesn't mean that. Why not? And I'll respond to it. And you can still raise it in class, and you should, right? Or maybe the written back and forth in the online forum just doesn't get it done for you. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with me and say, Doc, I know some of these people looking at me probably think I'm a knucklehead and why I don't get it. I don't care about them, right? I mean, I don't care that they wonder why I don't get it. I don't get it. And I need to get it because I'm practicing to be a professional and I want to get the questions right on the test and all that. And so please explain this to me again. Okay? But maybe the discussion on the online forum is good enough. And you go, oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Well, I'm sure glad I asked. And a bunch of other people reading the forum and not even participating. Oh, I'm glad you asked. Okay? So anyway, get after that. Remember, you also get extra credit for getting online forums. So asking a question by typing in a few words is worth more to you than just raising your hand in class, right? Again, you can always do both. Okay, so because the demand line on here is pretty steep, see, I don't even have it touching the y-axis, right? So we can't talk about that number way up there on the where the demand line hits the x-axis, right? The highest dollar amount that anybody's willing to pay for this commodity, in this case on skilled labor. And I drew it that way for a reason. One, just to give myself a little more space to work with. But see, that's one of the main arguments among economists here on this policy. See, despite the fact that it's inefficient to have a minimum wage above the market equilibrium, and all economists agree on that, because if you reduce employment below the market equilibrium, there's going to be a deadweight loss. But many economists have signed a letter that says, yeah, let's raise the minimum wage to 10.10, and some of even a smaller number have signed a letter that says, no, that's not high enough, let's raise it to 15. Okay, and where does that come from? It comes from two things. A value judgment that a raise to some is worth a job loss to others, okay? And a judgment about the empirical science of that, well, the empirical science in this case, which means attempts to measure the rate at which the quantity employed drops with the increase in the wage. See, there's been quite a bit of difficulty estimating that. Some economists have taken that to mean that the effect is statistically insignificant, which means really small. They've taken that to mean that if the minimum wage is set high, that won't cost very many jobs. Okay, and so based on that, then they can say, okay, this doesn't cost many jobs, and almost everybody will get a raise, a big raise. Okay, whatever, if we set the minimum wage at 15, a big raise over what the wage in the market would have been, and only a few people that would have been working will not be working as a result. Other economists say, no. Now, we may be struggling to measure the rate at which jobs are lost as the wage increases, but that's just a figment of our poor methodology or our struggle to create data that's clear. And see, and part of that is the fact that in some data sets include labor markets where the minimum wage isn't relevant. Okay, so, if some parts of a state, for example, you have data for a particular state, if some parts of a state, the labor market could be such that the minimum wage of that state doesn't matter, right? The market equilibrium is higher than that. And so when you try to measure the effect of increasing the minimum wage, you're sort of swamping the effect where it does matter, some parts of the state, the higher minimum might matter, with it doesn't matter in other parts of the state. Anyway, so that's just a little sampler of why it could be difficult to get a good handle on actual from real world data on how much job loss there is. Okay, so some economists will say, okay, there's not much job loss. Others will say, no, I disagree. There is a lot of job loss. And then the next step is, okay, well, there is some job loss. And some economists will say, well, not much. So, yeah, I would be willing to do this, because a lot of people get a raise and only a few people are without a job as a result. And I think, no. Even with only a few people losing their jobs, those are the least skilled people, right, that aren't worth the higher amount, and they're going to really struggle to find work. So no, it's not worth a higher wage for some. So for the least valuable, least skilled workers to get a start in the labor market. Okay. So I'm not sure why I held up this graph over that whole time, because most of that wasn't particular to this graph, but I'm not going to record all of this again, so you'll have to look at it over my knuckle, okay, and around that graph later on to think about what I was saying. Now we're going to go on to the graph. Let's interpret what this says. Okay, so here we have an example of a labor market, hypothetical one, where if we just left it alone and there were no rules about what you had to pay people, that the wage would settle in at $7 an hour. Okay, where the quantity demanded at that price would be $1.25, and the amount supplied would be $1.25. And so that means if you wanted to hire somebody with not too much skill, or somebody with skill but willing to work in a job that doesn't require any, maybe somebody that's retired and wants to, have a skill at something that they used to do, and it's getting kind of getting bored here, and maybe I'll go greet people at Walmart for 10 hours a week or something like that, and so they apply for a low-skill job. Okay, so that supply includes all those people. Teenagers that haven't got any skills yet, retirees that are willing to work in jobs that don't require any skills. All that's embedded in that supply line. Okay, so in that particular market represented by this, that hypothetical market that this graph represents, at $7 an hour, employers are going to be able to find all the workers that they want at that price, at the number 125 in this case. 125 hours per day of labor, say. For my L, I didn't write down how many, the time frame, whether it's weeks or months or days. And 125 hours per day, or it could be in thousands 125,000 hours per day if the wage is allowed to be market determined at $7 an hour, which in this case would mean it was $7 an hour. But then suppose the wage is set at a higher level. Okay, so a law is passed either by the state or local that says you want to hire somebody, you're not allowed to pay them less than $10 an hour. So think about what that means. That means that anybody that, for whatever reason, whose labor is worth less than $10 an hour will no longer be employable. Okay, maybe they can get a subsidy by somebody. That could be a charity would say, look, so-and-so is kind of slow. Yeah, they get the job done, but they're not so fast for whatever reason. And so to make sure that they get meaningful work, even though their labor isn't worth $10 an hour, I'll chip in $1 or $2 an hour. So that's a wage subsidy. And the government might do that as an alternative to the minimum wage. So for example, if an economist says, or anybody for that matter, says, no, minimum wage, no, that doesn't mean they're against helping unskilled people have greater incomes. They might just say, look, I think there's a better policy for doing that, and here's what it is. Okay, so a minimum wage policy is not an all or nothing thing in terms of the intended beneficiaries. They're made. The person might say, well, I don't want to do anything, just free market, keep the government out of it. Or they might say, here's a better way for the government to intervene rather than in the marketplace setting prices. All right, so let's suppose that the political process does produce the $10 an hour minimum wage. Now, the amount of labor desired by businesses, those are the demanders, falls as a result of the $3 an hour additional cost from 7 to 10, falls from 125 to 100. That's job loss, right? The 25 hour, that 25 difference. 125 employed at $7 an hour, only 100 employed at $10 an hour, right? So that's the job loss. The unemployment that results from that $3 an hour increase from 7 up to 10 is 70, right? The unemployment, the surplus labor, is the difference not between how many would be working before and after, right? The L sub E versus the L sub D. By the way, this is a L sub D here, not a zero. Kind of looks like a zero, doesn't it? That's a quantity demanded, right? Because it comes from up here on the demand line. I'm taking the 10 over to the demand line. All right, so the 70 is the unemployment quantity, right? The number of people who would like to work at $10 an hour but can't find a job, right? Unemployment, that's what that means. Willing to work at the going price, can't get a job, includes not just those who had been working at the lower wage, the $7 an hour. It includes 45 more, 170 minus 25, 45 more that enter the labor market that hadn't been in the unskilled labor market, except that now that it pays more if they can find a job. And one of the sad truths about this policy that not a whole lot of people think about is, you see where I darkened the supply line there? See, that really represents the people that enter the labor market as a result of the wage going from 7 to 10. Those are people whose opportunity costs were too high for them to be willing to work at $7 an hour. But at $10 an hour, they go thumbs up and say, I'm filing an application, or a bunch. Okay, now I'm willing to work. Now think about that, what that means. Higher opportunity cost. It means they have other valuable things that they do, things that they value more than $7 an hour. Typically what that means is that they have higher skills. Not always. Maybe they have kids to care for, and it's not worth giving up it's worth giving up $7 an hour employment to stay home with the kids, and not worth giving up some of that time to work at $10 an hour. Okay, but a lot of it is, I'm a college student. It's not worth giving up study time for $7 an hour, but for $10 an hour, yeah. Or prolong my stay at the U, right? How do we mean prolong stay at the U? Well, maybe you decide at $10 an hour, you don't want to stress out and have too little time to do your coursework, so you just take fewer courses. So to enable the employment at $10 an hour. You say, college isn't that bad if I have a little money jingling in my pocket, parties and dates and all of that stuff and spring breaks. Make it 5 years instead of 4. okay, and earn $10 an hour. Now think about that. You're a college student, and you decide to go look for a job. How do you think you'll fare against somebody who's willing to work for $7 an hour, maybe because they didn't even finish high school? You think the employer might prefer you over them? I think so. You see? So the folks represented by this dark line on the supply line, the higher opportunity cost labor that enters the market as a result of the higher wage, they often displace the lower opportunity cost labor, probably people who have few choices other than low-skilled labor to move themselves forward. They're not in a training program. Okay? They're not in college. They need unskilled, low-skill work in order to progress in the labor market to get some skills to eventually get to a higher-paying job, whereas you're a college student, and that's eventually going to produce a higher-paying job for you. See, that's not often taken into account. Some of that 45, the difference between 170 and 125, is going to displace some of the 100 that would otherwise be working if only the original people who are working at $7 an hour will be the only ones still working at $10 an hour, right? So let's just suppose the extreme case. Okay, all 45 get a job. Okay, the people that enter the market when the wage goes up. So what does that mean? Well, that means out of the 125, out of the 100 that are going to be working at $10 an hour, 45 of them were the folks who just entered the labor market because of the higher wage. Whoops. That means out of the original 125, only 55 of them are still working, right? 100 minus the 45, 55. Whoa. Didn't think of that. Think about everything. There's a lot of information in these supply and demand graphs. Okay, let's kind of go back here and review some of the language with using this graph that we discussed previously. If we set a price through price controls, right? The $10 is a price floor. The quantity actually purchased will be lower than it had been previously, right? The quantity actually purchased by businesses will be 100 rather than 125. Yes, 170 is available, but when the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied differ, the amount actually purchased will be the lesser of the two, and the lesser of the two is always a number smaller than the market equilibrium. See, that's why it's positive economics to say that that a minimum wage set above the market equilibrium in a competitive labor market will create job loss, and that will create inefficiency. That's positive economics. Now, whether that means that it shouldn't be done, that we shouldn't have a minimum wage, that's normative economics. And again, the proof there is that economists who understand this graph disagree on whether there should be a minimum wage, and they disagree on how high it should be, right? Because of that trade-off between how many they think will be out of a job as a result of the higher wage versus how many of the remaining ones will get a job and enjoy a higher paycheck as a result. There's also a sort of a moralistic issue here. Should the government be basically seizing the money of some people to force them to pay it to others? That's not a subject we can answer in an economics class. But I mean, that's what's going on here, right? You're saying that willing buyers, if you're setting the minimum wage above the market, what you're saying is that the result of freedom, willing buyer, willing seller, market interactions, that's what that is. Freedom is not okay. That you're not allowed to sell your labor if you want to below a government set amount. And you're not allowed to buy labor even if somebody's perfectly willing to do it for anything less than, in this case of this graph, $10 an hour. Okay, so those are all things to take into account. I'm looking off to the side here, making sure that I've got everything. One of the things that I want to discuss goes back to that price ceiling effect. And you're saying, wait a minute, Doc, this is a price floor. Yeah, but there's already one similarity, the quantity actually purchased to be lower. But one of the things that happens here is because Yeah, I said the important thing is that there's a surplus of labor, but there's a job shortage. And a surplus of labor means there's people standing in line waiting for particular jobs, right? In other words, the employer, in the face of this $10 minimum wage and the surplus, the 70 surplus, 170 minus 100, because of that, that means they've got a stack of applications at any given moment, just ready right away, snapping my fingers, to replace any of their employees that decide that they're unhappy or that they're being worked too hard or whatever. So it doesn't do you any good to complain, and the employer can kind of abuse you if they're predisposed. And I'm not saying every employer is predisposed to that, but there are marginal employers, just like there's marginal everything. Some of them will take advantage of the fact that they can tell you, if you think you're working too hard, quit. I'll replace you tomorrow. Okay? So, a shortage erodes quality. So what does it do in this case? Well, a job shortage erodes job quality. You'll be worked harder. You'll get fewer fringe benefits if there's a long list of people ready to take your job, which there will be at $10 an hour, and there will not be at $7 an hour. Does that mean they'll just dump you right away for nothing? For just any, you sneeze at work and they get tired of you sneezing, or you show up late or something a couple times? No, because the training costs money. Okay, so they don't like to go through the process of going through applications and interviews and all that. But that notwithstanding, they do know that it won't be difficult, comparatively speaking, to replace you if you're not thrilled to death, or they're just not thrilled to death with you for whatever reason. And that will cause them to be a little tougher on you and not bother with fringes that they might otherwise. Maybe they'll charge you for meals at the restaurant, whereas if it was at $7 an hour, they'd say, it's really difficult to get good people, and we don't want to have to find somebody else because there won't be that many applicants at $7. Yeah, some, but not that many. And so let's treat these folks pretty well, and it doesn't cost us much to let them have free meals at the restaurant. Okay, so there goes that fringe now. Now it's $10 an hour. They've got tons of applicants, and they can say, it costs us something. We're already paying $10 an hour. That's way more than what we used to be paying. We don't need to give them free meals. We don't need to give them many days off. All those things that they might do at $7 an hour to keep you rather than to find new people, which would be harder to do at $7 an hour than to find people at $10 an hour. All right. Let's see. Did I cover everything on the minimum wage side? I believe I did. All right. I'll see you soon. Okay? Got lots of questions, hopefully. A good mix of videos and face-to-face content, I think, is good. Because, again, you can watch this anytime you want. You can watch it again. And I'm not sure you want to do that, but at least the option is still there. So we'll see you in class soon.